Platte River Valley, Nebraska, March 1878. While most settlers completed their cabins using traditional saddle notching, Joseph Harrington was still carefully chiseling dovetail joints on his fourth corner after 9 weeks of construction. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He was crafting interlocking joints that required 14 days per corner, 7 times longer than standard frontier construction. The elaborate joinery system consumed 280 hours of labor compared to the 40 hours typical settlers invested in corner notching. Martin Keller shook his head, saying, "I've built 15 cabins on this prairie, and not one needed such fussiness." Local builder Edward Simmons, who'd raised 32 structures in the Platte River settlement, declared simple saddle notching had served generations of pioneers perfectly well. Settlement founder Thomas Walsh predicted that, come summer, Harrington would wish he had a roof over his head rather than pretty corners nobody would notice anyway. The technical reality of Harrington's approach was undeniably excessive by frontier standards. Where conventional wisdom called for simple saddle notching that required minimal precision and could be completed in 2 to 3 days per corner, Harrington methodically crafted dovetail joints with 45-degree precision angles that interlocked like pieces of fine furniture. Each log end required 6 separate cutting operations, with specialized tools that Harrington had brought from his previous life as a Vermont furniture maker. The mathematical burden of his method became increasingly apparent as March progressed. Where Keller's standard cabin corners required approximately 40 total hours of labor, a manageable investment for most settlers, Harrington's elaborate joinery demanded 280 hours of precise cutting, fitting, and adjusting. The additional 240 hours represented 6 weeks of extra work, time that other settlers used to complete roofing, flooring, and interior finishing. That man's spending more time on 4 corners than I spent building my entire cabin, Walsh told his wife Rebecca one evening, watching as Harrington carefully measured yet another precision cut with tools no frontier settler had ever seen. Waste of good cabin time, if you ask me. The criticism carried weight in a community where completing shelter quickly meant the difference between establishing crops on schedule or missing crucial planting windows. Walsh's cabin, built according to standard specifications, featured simple saddle-notched corners, completed in just 8 days total, allowing his family to move in before winter and prepare for spring planting. Simmons brought professional authority to the growing skepticism. His credentials were unquestionable. 2 decades of frontier building experience had taught him that efficiency trumped precision in the harsh Nebraska environment. His standard design called for saddle notches, requiring just 10 hours per corner, a measurement he had refined through years of practical experience. "I've raised 32 structures in this valley," Simmons declared to anyone within earshot. Simple saddle notches are plenty for any cabin. Harrington is either building a furniture showroom or has more time than sense. The settlement's newest member, Professor James Thornton, arriving to establish Nebraska's first weather monitoring station, observed Harrington's work with scientific curiosity. "Interesting approach," he noted, examining the precisely angled cuts. "Though I wonder if such precision addresses the primary structural threats in this region." When asked to elaborate, Thornton mentioned something that caused Walsh to laugh dismissively. "Nebraska sits directly in what my meteorological colleagues are beginning to call Tornado Alley. These prairies see more rotational windstorms than almost anywhere on the continent." Walsh waved away the concern. "20 years I've lived here. Sure, we get our spring storms, but a well-built saddle-notched cabin handles them fine." He pointed toward Harrington's half-finished structure. "No fancy corners needed." As March ended and Harrington continued his methodical work, the contrast between his unfinished cabin and his neighbors' completed dwellings became increasingly stark. Keller had already planted early crops. Simmons was constructing his second outbuilding. Walsh's established homestead demonstrated the practical results of efficient construction methods adapted to frontier conditions. Harrington, meanwhile, continued crafting his elaborate joints with a quiet determination that puzzled his neighbors. His slow, meticulous approach defied the most fundamental principle of frontier survival. Shelter comes first, refinement later, if at all. The technical foundations of Harrington's approach emerged gradually through conversations with curious neighbors. His background as a third-generation furniture maker, trained in the Vermont Guild, explained his reverence for precision joinery. While frontier builders measured in inches, Harrington worked to 1/16-inch tolerances, a standard unheard of in prairie construction. His specialized tools, including a set of 7 precisely calibrated chisels, 2 Japanese pull saws, and a custom-made 45-degree angle gauge, represented an investment of $78, equivalent to the cost of a standard cabin's entire material budget. Wood speaks if you listen, Harrington explained to young Timothy Keller, who had begun watching the methodical construction with increasing fascination. When wind pushes against these walls, standard saddle notches rely solely on gravity and weight to maintain stability. My dovetails create a mechanical lock that actually tightens under pressure. To demonstrate, Harrington set up a simple test using 2 8-inch log sections. The saddle-notched piece separated with 67 pounds of lateral force, while his dovetail joint required 415 pounds before showing signs of stress, a 619% increase in strength. The mathematical reality was compelling, yet frontier pragmatism questioned whether such strength was necessary or worth the additional construction time. The problem with standard corners, Harrington continued while carefully shaving precise angles on a red oak beam, is that they only resist vertical forces effectively. Lateral pressure, particularly the lifting and twisting forces in severe wind events, finds the weakest point in conventional construction. Professor Thornton, the settlement's weather observer, found himself increasingly intrigued by Harrington's structural theories. His meteorological instruments had already recorded spring winds gusting to 54 miles per hour, creating visible movement in standard cabin walls, while Harrington's partially completed structure remained eerily stable. Wind creates complex force vectors, Thornton observed, watching Harrington test fit a particularly challenging joint. Standard building practices address the most common conditions, but rarely account for extreme events. The resource requirements of Harrington's method became increasingly clear as April turned to May. His specialized tools required weekly maintenance. Each corner consumed approximately 70 board feet of premium lumber, with specific pieces selected for grain orientation and structural properties. Where standard construction accepted logs with up to 15% moisture content, Harrington rejected any wood measuring above 9%, requiring additional drying time that further delayed completion. Martin Keller's frustration grew as he observed Harrington's seemingly endless precision adjustments. "My entire family helped raise our cabin in 14 days," he reminded anyone willing to listen. "We've weathered 3 Nebraska winters in it already." Meanwhile, he'll still be cutting corners when the snow flies. The criticism intensified when a thunderstorm swept through the settlement on April 23rd. 6-inch rainfall accompanied by 40 mph winds tested every structure in the valley. Several families reported leaking roofs and minor structural damage. Edward Simmons spent 3 days repairing wind-damaged siding on the settlement's communal storehouse. Thomas Walsh discovered that his north wall had shifted nearly 2 inches at its base, requiring urgent reinforcement. Harrington's partially completed cabin showed no measurable movement, despite lacking a completed roof. The exposed dovetail corners, rather than weakening in the driving rain, actually tightened as the wood fibers expanded, creating an even more secure connection, that demonstrations of the technical principle he had attempted to explain. "Interesting," Professor Thornton remarked, inspecting the corners with scientific curiosity after the storm. "The joinery actually creates a self-reinforcing system under environmental stress." The weather event converted skepticism to curiosity among several neighbors. Timothy Keller began spending afternoons watching Harrington's methodical work, asking increasingly technical questions about joint angles and wood selection criteria. Even Martin acknowledged the impressive stability of the partial structure, though he maintained that the additional labor remained unjustifiable. By late May 1879, nearly 3 months after his neighbors had completed their dwellings, Harrington finished the final dovetail joint of his cabin. The completed structure featured 8 precisely crafted corners, with interlocking joints that appeared to merge the logs into a single continuous system rather than stacked individual pieces. While standard cabins displayed obvious gaps and imperfections at their corners, Harrington's creation exhibited furniture-quality precision throughout its structural elements. Finally, Walsh observed with a mixture of relief and lingering skepticism, now we'll see if all that fussiness was worth the wait. By early June 1879, Harrington's completed cabin stood as a stark contrast to the settlement's standard structures. The 8 dovetail corners formed a unified framework that distributed weight and pressure throughout the entire building, rather than concentrating stress at connection points. Each corner featured 6 interlocking angles that created mechanical resistance against lifting forces, a characteristic absent in traditional saddle-notched construction. The technical specifications revealed the mathematical precision underlying Harrington's approach. Each dovetail joint could withstand 450 pounds of lateral pressure and 700 pounds of lifting force without separation. Standard corners began failing at 70 pounds of lateral pressure and offered virtually no resistance to upward forces. This 600% improvement in lateral strength translated to structural integrity that would prove crucial in high-wind environments. It's like the difference between stacking blocks versus locking them together, Harrington explained to young Timothy Keller, who had become his regular observer. When wind hits a cabin wall, it creates both pushing and lifting pressures. Standard corners rely mainly on weight to stay in place. A late spring storm on June the 2nd provided the first significant test of competing structural designs. Winds gusting to 62 miles per hour swept across the settlement, creating visible movement in standard cabin walls. Thomas Walsh reported his entire structure swayed noticeably during the strongest gusts. Martin Keller discovered a 1-inch gap had opened between his roof and north wall, allowing rain to penetrate the interior. Professor Thornton conducted systematic measurements the following morning, documenting structural movement throughout the settlement. Standard cabins showed displacement ranging from 1.2 to 1.8 inches at their upper corners. Wall logs had shifted laterally by up to 0.9 inches in several structures. By contrast, Harrington's cabin showed no measurable movement at any connection point, maintaining perfect alignment despite enduring identical wind forces. The physics are undeniable, Thornton observed, while examining Harrington's corners with a measuring square. Standard connections allow independent movement of each log. These dovetails force the structure to react as a single unit. The scientific principles behind Harrington's approach became increasingly apparent as Thornton continued his analysis. Traditional saddle notching created what engineers called simple gravity connections, joints held together primarily by downward pressure and friction. Dovetail joinery established mechanical interlocks that resisted movement in all directions. When subjected to lateral pressure, standard corners allowed logs to slide against each other until friction and corner notching halted movement. Dovetail joints prevented initial movement by forcing any log displacement to overcome the mechanical resistance of precisely angled interlocks. More importantly, while wind pressure weakened standard connections by working against gravity, it actually strengthened dovetail joints by driving the angled surfaces more tightly together. A visiting engineer named William Stevenson, traveling through Nebraska on a railroad survey project, provided professional validation of Harrington's techniques. Stevenson had studied structural failures throughout the Western Territories and recognized the superior engineering principles in the dovetail cabin. I've documented 17 structural failures due to wind events across Nebraska and Kansas, Stevenson told the gathered settlers after examining both construction styles. In every case, the failure point was corner separation under lateral or lifting pressure. Precisely what these dovetail joints are designed to prevent. Despite this professional endorsement, most settlers remain skeptical about the practical necessity of such elaborate joinery. Edward Simmons acknowledged the technical superiority, but questioned whether Nebraska's weather justified the additional construction time. Walsh maintained that his cabin had weathered 3 years of storms without catastrophic failure, proving that standard methods were good enough for practical purposes. The meteorological context for this debate was becoming increasingly relevant. Professor Thornton's weather observations documented a troubling pattern developing across the region. Barometric pressure readings showed unusual instability. Temperature differentials between northern and southern air masses were creating volatile conditions across the Central Plains. His recent correspondence with scientific colleagues confirmed that the spring of 1879 was developing into one of the most active storm seasons in recorded history. The atmospheric conditions we're observing, Thornton explained with growing concern as he reviewed his logbooks, are remarkably similar to those that preceded the devastating tornadic outbreak in Irving, Kansas, just last year. Harrington listened to this assessment with quiet attentiveness, making final adjustments to his cabin's storm shutters and reinforcing the roof tie-downs with ironwork that no other settler had considered necessary. The early days of June 1879 brought atmospheric conditions that raised alarm among weather-aware settlers throughout Nebraska Territory. Professor Thornton's daily barometric readings showed rapid pressure fluctuations, dropping from 30.12 inches to 29.47 inches within a 12-hour period on June 14th, a warning sign recognized by experienced plainsmen. The morning skies developed an unsettling greenish tinge, while afternoon temperatures reached an unseasonable 91 degrees, despite strong northwesterly winds. These conditions mirror the Springfield tornado of '74, Thornton explained to a gathering of concerned settlers, when warm southern air masses collide with cool northern fronts over these plains. The atmospheric instability creates ideal conditions for rotational storms. Historical weather records would later confirm that the spring of 1879 created one of the most active tornado seasons in recorded history across the Central Plains. The unusual combination of a lingering winter followed by rapid warming had established precisely the temperature differentials that spawned powerful supercell thunderstorms capable of producing devastating tornadoes. Throughout the settlement, families began implementing standard storm preparations developed through generations of frontier experience. Root cellars were cleared for emergency shelter. Valuable livestock was moved to protected areas. Food and water supplies were positioned for quick access. These precautions reflected the practical wisdom accumulated through years of prairie living. Martin Keller inspected his cabin's roof tie-downs, adding additional wooden pegs at critical junctures where previous storms had caused minor separation. Thomas Walsh reinforced his storm shutters with crossbars designed to prevent wind penetration during severe gusts. Edward Simmons helped neighboring families secure loose equipment and materials that could become dangerous projectiles in high winds. Harrington's preparations, by contrast, revealed a fundamentally different understanding of structural vulnerabilities during extreme wind events. While his neighbors focused primarily on preventing water infiltration and securing loose items, Harrington systematically addressed the structural weak points that caused catastrophic failures during tornadic winds. Standard cabins fail from the top down, he explained to Timothy Keller, who had arrived asking about additional protective measures. Wind creates a lifting force on the roof, separating it from wall logs. Once the roof disconnects, walls lose lateral stability and collapse outward. Harrington's additional reinforcements included iron strapping that connected roof beams directly to wall logs, creating a continuous load path from roof peak to foundation. a concept unheard of in frontier construction. He installed diagonal bracing across wall corners, providing triangulated support against racking forces that standard rectangular framing couldn't resist. Most notably, he constructed interior support posts connected to both floor and roof systems, creating a redundant structural framework that could maintain integrity even if exterior walls failed. The technical contrast between standard and dovetail construction became starkly apparent when examining specific vulnerability points. In conventional cabins, roof systems simply rested atop wall logs, creating a gravity-dependent connection easily compromised by lifting forces. Corner joints relied on notching and weight to maintain position, offering minimal resistance to lateral movement. Wall logs remained essentially independent structural elements, each capable of shifting individually under stress. Harrington's dovetail system created fundamentally different structural characteristics. Each log became an integral component of a unified system, unable to move independently without overcoming the mechanical resistance of precision joints. The continuous structural connections distributed forces throughout the entire building rather than concentrating stress at vulnerable points. Most importantly, the entire system was designed to respond to wind as a cohesive unit rather than as a collection of individual components. As evening approached on June 15th, the atmospheric conditions deteriorated rapidly. Thunderheads towered to 40,000 feet, visible from the settlement as massive, anvil-shaped formations blotting out the western horizon. The temperature dropped suddenly from 88 to 67 degrees, as the competing air masses created the shearing effect known to generate rotational winds. Barometric pressure plummeted to 29.31 inches, the lowest reading Professor Thornton had recorded since establishing his weather station. These readings indicate severe instability, Thornton announced gravely to the families gathering at the community storehouse. I strongly recommend everyone seek shelter in root cellars or reinforced interior rooms tonight. As darkness fell across the Platte River Valley, Harrington made final preparations to his cabin. Unlike his neighbors who planned to shelter in dugout cellars, Harrington believed his reinforced structure would provide superior protection during a direct strike. He secured interior shutters over windows, checked his structural reinforcements one final time, and placed emergency supplies in his central reinforced area. In his leather-bound journal, Harrington made a final entry that evening. Standard frontier construction fails catastrophically in rotational winds because it addresses only the forces encountered in common weather events. The true test of structural integrity isn't survivability during normal conditions, but performance during extreme events that find every weakness in design and execution. The night grew ominously still as settlers completed their preparations and took shelter. By midnight, the distant rumble of approaching thunderstorms echoed across the prairie. The real test of competing structural philosophies was hours away. June 16, 1879, 2:17 a.m. The tornado struck the Platte River settlement with catastrophic fury. A massive F4 vortex measuring approximately 440 yards wide, with estimated wind speeds exceeding 175 miles per hour. The atmospheric pressure at the funnel's edge dropped to 28.34 inches, creating a pressure differential that exerted lifting forces of 89 pounds per square foot on structures in its path, enough to peel standard roofing away like paper. The approach registered as a low, constant roar that residents would later describe as like 50 freight trains bearing down all at once. The destruction sequence followed patterns documented in previous tornadic events, revealing fatal weaknesses in standard frontier construction. Initial wind gusts created lateral forces that tested corner connections throughout the settlement. As the main vortex approached, rapidly dropping pressure generated powerful lifting forces that attacked the weakest link in conventional cabin design, the gravity-dependent connection between roof systems and wall logs. The Walsh family's cabin, built with traditional saddle-notched corners, experienced catastrophic structural failure within seconds of the tornado's arrival. Wind forces initially created a 4-inch deflection in the eastern wall, breaking the integrity of corner connections that relied solely on notching and weight for stability. As pressure differentials intensified, the roof system separated completely from the supporting walls, lifting approximately 18 inches before wind-driven debris shattered the exposed structural elements. With the roof compromised, the remaining wall logs lost lateral stability and collapsed outward like fallen dominoes. The Keller cabin withstood the initial wind surge, but succumbed when a massive cottonwood tree, uprooted from 70 yards away, struck its western corner at approximately 2:19 a.m. The impact transferred 4,700 pounds of force directly to the saddle-notched joints, instantly separating the corner connection and compromising the entire structural system. Once the corner failed, the cabin's remaining structural integrity collapsed within seconds, the walls pancaking inward as unified corner resistance disappeared. Simmons's 2-year-old cabin, considered among the most solidly built in the settlement, survived approximately 27 seconds longer than surrounding structures. Its heavier logs and metal reinforcement straps delayed initial failure, but the fundamental weaknesses in standard corner joinery eventually proved fatal. The precisely documented failure sequence began with the southeast corner, separating under combined lifting and lateral pressures, followed by progressive structural collapse, moving counterclockwise around the foundation as each corner failed in succession. Throughout the settlement, 16 of the 17 traditionally constructed cabins suffered catastrophic structural failure, their components scattered across the prairie in a display of destructive force that defied frontier building wisdom. The community storehouse collapsed entirely, its contents strewn over a quarter-mile radius. Walsh's prized draft horses were found 320 yards from their stable. The settlement's communal water wheel, anchored in 18 inches of concrete, had vanished entirely. Harrington's dovetail notched cabin, directly in the tornado's path, responded to the extreme forces as a unified structural system rather than as individual components. The dovetail corners, engineered to resist both lateral and lifting pressures, tightened under stress rather than separating. Wind forces attempting to lift the roof encountered a continuous load path that transferred stress throughout the entire structure instead of concentrating it at vulnerable connection points. The cabin swayed visibly during the most intense winds, the entire structure moving as a single unit with measured deflections of 7 inches at its highest point before returning to position. 2 windows shattered under debris impact, but the interior shutters prevented wind penetration that would have created internal pressurization, another common failure point in traditional construction. The northwest corner suffered minor separation when struck by the Simmons cabin roof, but the redundant structural bracing prevented progressive collapse that would have been inevitable in standard construction. Harrington, along with the Thornton family, and young Timothy Keller, who had sought shelter there after their root cellar flooded, rode out the tornado's full fury within the cabin's reinforced central area. The structure groaned and creaked under enormous stress, but the interlocking joinery system maintained its critical connections throughout the 4-minute ordeal. Dawn revealed a landscape transformed by devastation. Where a thriving settlement had stood, only scattered debris and foundations remained. The sole exception stood in stark contrast. Harrington's cabin, though damaged, maintained its structural integrity with all 4 walls standing and its roof system intact. The technical principles that had seemed excessive and unnecessary during construction had proven essential for survival under extreme conditions. Professor Thornton, emerging from the shelter of Harrington's cabin, surveyed the destruction with scientific detachment that barely masked his personal shock. The failure points are exactly as predicted, he observed, examining the scattered remains of standard corner joinery. Traditional connections simply cannot withstand the combined lateral and lifting forces generated by rotational winds of this magnitude. Martin Keller, who had survived in his root cellar while his cabin disintegrated above him, approached Harrington's standing structure with an expression that transformed from disbelief to dawning comprehension. "Your corners," he said simply, touching the intact dovetail joint. They held. The July sun beat down on a transformed landscape as the Platte River settlement began its slow recovery. Where 17 cabins had stood, only Harrington's remained, its dovetail-notched corners standing as silent testimony to structural principles that had withstood nature's most violent assault. The rebuilding process revealed a fundamental shift in community attitude toward construction methods, previously dismissed as excessive and unnecessary. Martin Keller, who had lost everything except his family, approached Harrington on the third day of recovery efforts. "I want to rebuild with your method," he stated simply, examining the dovetail joints that had maintained their integrity through 175 mph winds. "Whatever it takes, however long it requires." This sentiment echoed throughout the devastated community as families calculating their losses recognized the true economics of frontier construction. Walsh's traditional cabin, built in 14 days with standard notching, had disappeared entirely, representing a complete loss of 340 labor hours and $187 in materials. Harrington's cabin, requiring 94 days of construction and $253 in materials, remained functional despite requiring minor repairs. The mathematical validation was undeniable. An additional 80 days of construction had preserved 94 days of labor investment, while standard methods resulted in total loss. The technical knowledge transfer began immediately as Harrington established systematic training sessions for the rebuilding effort. He demonstrated the precise 45-degree cutting techniques that created interlocking joints capable of withstanding both lateral and lifting forces. His specialized tools, once objects of ridicule, became community resources shared among rebuilding families. The Vermont Guild principles of structural integrity, previously considered irrelevant to frontier construction, now form the foundation of the settlement's architectural approach. Edward Simmons, whose professional reputation had been built on traditional building methods, underwent the most dramatic transformation. After methodically examining the failure points in conventional joinery scattered across the prairie, he approached Harrington with uncharacteristic humility. "I've built structures for 20 years, believing that speed and efficiency were the primary considerations," Simmons acknowledged, as he studied Harrington's detailed construction diagrams. "This tornado has revealed that structural integrity during extreme events must take precedence." The economic impact calculations painted a compelling picture of prevention versus reconstruction. Professor Thornton, applying his scientific methodology to the community recovery, documented that implementing dovetail construction would have required an additional 1,360 labor hours for the settlement's 17 cabins, approximately 80 hours per structure. The tornado destruction represented a combined loss of 5,780 labor hours and $3,179 in materials, plus incalculable losses in personal possessions, livestock, and agricultural productivity. The knowledge transfer process extended beyond the immediate settlement as word of the Platte River miracle spread throughout Nebraska territory. By August, visitors from settlements as far as 70 miles away traveled to examine Harrington's cabin and learn the dovetail techniques that had proven so crucial to survival. Regional newspapers published accounts of the lone standing structure amidst total devastation, complete with technical illustrations of the joinery system that had withstood nature's most extreme test. Government land surveyors, documenting the tornado's impact, noted the structural anomaly in official reports. Lieutenant James Worthington of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers made a specific journey to examine Harrington's construction, subsequently incorporating his findings into military construction guidelines for outposts throughout tornado-prone territories. "The structural principles demonstrated here," Worthington wrote in his official assessment, "represent a significant advancement in our understanding of tornadic wind effects on frontier construction. The dovetail joinery system while requiring additional labor investment, provides measurable survival advantages during extreme wind events that justify its immediate adoption in vulnerable regions. By 1890, the ripple effects of Harrington's vindicated approach had transformed building practices throughout Nebraska and neighboring territories. Regional building codes, formalized as settlements, grew into established towns, specifically required mechanical corner joinery for all new public structures. Architectural guidelines published by the Nebraska Territorial Building Commission included detailed specifications for dovetail construction, acknowledging the Harrington method by name. The technical legacy extended into modern engineering principles, validated by subsequent tornado events. The 1883 tornado that struck Hallam, Nebraska destroyed 19 of 24 traditionally constructed buildings, while all 6 structures built with dovetail joinery remained standing. The mathematical relationship between joint strength and survival became increasingly clear with each documented event. Modern structural engineering studies would eventually confirm what Joseph Harrington had intuitively understood, that standard frontier construction addressed only the forces encountered in common conditions, while structural integrity, during extreme events, required fundamentally different approaches to joint design and load distribution. The Vermont furniture maker, who had been ridiculed for excessive perfectionism, left a legacy that extended far beyond the Platte River Valley, transforming frontier architecture throughout America's tornado-prone regions and saving countless lives through principles that valued structural integrity over speed and convenience.